So let's have a seat.
Absolutely.
And we'll get into this. So you and I have had the opportunity to visit over dinner last night and then here over lunch. And so I'm going to ask you a few questions that I know the answers to, but our guests likely do not and would like to appreciate hearing. Your ministry preparation, the MDiv at Westminster Seminary, California, and then you did the PhD at Edinburgh. And tell us a little bit about that, like what you got out of that. And now as the other side of it as an institution's president and your perspective from this side of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, my story actually even begins a tick earlier than that. I mean, some of you may know that I did my undergraduate work at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and I was just doing not a great year for us, but okay. I just did a video in the other room about calling and how I was called to the ministry, and some of you may know that when I was a freshman there, I had Bart Ehrman as a professor, and that was sort of a defining moment for my life because I was a believer, but I didn't have answers to any of those questions. So Lord used that to spur on me an interest in not only the truth of Christianity, but New Testament origins in particular. That made me investigate, so where do I want to go to seminary to get some of this? And there was an obvious interest there in apologetics that led me out to study with John Frame at Westminster in California. Even though I'm in the biblical studies route now, I wanted to get a good philosophical, theological foundation. So one of the things I really appreciate about my education there, and we do this at RTS too, and I'm sure you guys do at Midwestern, is strong theological, philosophical, apologetics foundation in your seminary curriculum just sets you up for all kinds of different good directions when you build on it. So by the time I got to Edinburgh for my PhD work, which was a secular program, and being bombarded with those various things, I felt like I had the worldview and the equipment to deal with it, because you can't just prepare yourself just by having enough data, because I didn't have enough data at that point. I had to prepare myself to have enough framework to handle whatever came. And so I think that was really critical for me when I got to Edinburgh.
So take us back to Chapel Hill. You mentioned Bart Ehrman. Do you remember the class you had?
Yeah, it's a New Testament introduction class. And the curriculum there requires your first 2 years are all general ed, and everybody has to take at least one religion class. And so I said, well, hey, it's a Bible class, I'll take it. And of course, you have to realize at this time, Bart Ehrman was not famous. He was a brand new professor, just hired, was at Rutgers. He was kind of a nobody at the time. And I could not have foreseen, nor anyone could have foreseen what he would end up being. But I just took what I thought was an innocuous New Testament intro class, and it was not innocuous. In fact, I was talking at our table here a minute ago that my daughter Emma is a freshman at UNC right now, and so she's going to have to take a religion class, and it'd be really ironic perhaps if she ended up in Bart Ehrman's class again. But yeah, it was New Testament intro.
So do you have any particular memories from that class?
Yeah, I have lots of memories from that class. It was...
Do tell.
Yeah, so it was about 300 or 400 students in a big auditorium. So no one really knew the professor in an intimate way. It was a big group. I remember Ehrman started off the class with an illustration about an ancient person in the first century who went around the areas of Palestine and Galilee doing miracles and had a great following and died and rose again 3 days later. And you think he's talking about Jesus, and he goes, and that person's name was Apollonius of Tyana. And the class was like, whoa, didn't see that one coming. And of course, his point there was, Jesus was nothing special in the ancient world. Apollonius was another miracle worker from that time period. And that set the tone for the class, which was provocative, sort of aggressive, combative. But at the same time, Bart is very persuasive and compelling and funny. And I mean, it was all the things that make a very intimidating environment for any 18, 19-year-old. And throughout the term, people would raise their hand and someone would try to object or push back. And of course, you can't go toe-to-toe with him. And so every interchange he would win, so to speak. And as the semester went by, more and more students, felt like it wasn't worth it to try to say anything to him. But what was particularly fascinating and sad was watching the effect on other Christian students in the class. And there was multiple reactions people had. Some people just refused to let it in. It's like, I'm taking this class and I don't even want to deal with it. I'm not even going to deal with it. I'm just going to pretend it didn't happen. Other Christians started really questioning their faith. Some ended up leaving the faith. Other Christians found compromised views where they're like, okay, so, Peter didn't write 2 Peter, but I still believe it's the word of God. And okay, I'm going to find a way to mesh these two together. And then there were others, and probably I fell in that camp, where it's like, well, no, there's got to be answers to these questions, and let's go find them.
So where were you in your personal spiritual development at that point in time?
Well, thankfully, I was in a good place spiritually. I entered UNC as a committed believer. I grew up in a Christian home, had an evangelical family who taught me the gospel at a young age. We were just talking at the table here. I can remember going to church here in Kansas City when I grew up at least my memory was, it was a Bible-believing church that taught us the gospel, and we're faithful members there. By the time I ended up at UNC, I was involved in a Christian fellowship and doing well spiritually. And even when I took Erwin's class, it's not as if I started doing badly in my spiritual life. It's just that I hit a crisis point of saying, I've got to deal with this, and I need to find a way to deal with it. And God's grace preserved me and got me through it.
I have mentioned on this campus and other settings many times over the years my own spiritual story, so I won't get into the weeds of that here. But to say I grew up in a Christian home like you, did not actually become a believer till my freshman year in college. Found myself on a campus very hostile to the Christian faith, to evangelical Christianity, and had required religion, philosophy classes, et cetera. And just, you're in that class as an 18, 19-year-old young man, and you're just having to play defense like by every phrase that comes out of the professor's mouth. And a part of my calling here, and I know yours is RTS, is to have the opposite effect and to have students can come and be taught, be instructed in the faith, and not have to wonder from where professors are coming.
Absolutely.
And so when I went to seminary, having such a bad college experience, I want to go to a seminary that like I wasn't going to have to wonder what the professors believed, wonder what they were going to teach, try to kind of find my way through a class and find conservative authors to offset what I'm being taught. And it really was just, for me, sent me on a beeline for a healthy institution.
Yep, absolutely.
And it sounds like it did for you as well, going to Westminster.
It did, and that's what we're committed to at RTS as well. And many of you are familiar with Reformed Theological Seminary. I mean, we're robustly committed to making sure when our students come, they're going to get faithful, consistent biblical instruction. Professors committed to the inspiration and inerrancy of the Bible, and committed to the gospel of God's grace, salvation through faith alone in Christ alone. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of seminaries out there that we all know that where if you were an evangelical student at those seminaries, you would have to sort of figure your way through it, right? And accept some, reject some, and sort of you got your guard up half the time, wondering if I should trust this or not. And we want to create an environment where students can come and really just soak up what God's word has to say without having to feel like they're in combat all the time.
So you're interested in New Testament studies, canonicity, things like this. Does that go back to Bart Ehrman?
Initially, yeah. So I think what Ehrman sparked in me was an interest in the whole field of what's called Christian origins. And so that includes many things. That includes certainly the canon and why these books and not others. And Ehrman would be big about pushing apocryphal books. It deals with textual transmission, but it also deals with sort of the development of Jesus tradition within early Christianity and sort of how Christianity was born and how it made its way through the Greco-Roman world. And so my recent book on second century Christianity was as part of that whole matrix of Christian origin. So yeah, in a bizarre way, I can credit Bart Ehrman with my field of interest. And I think, God uses all kinds of things for good, and hopefully that is an example of how I use it for good. But then in all of that, canon has become the thing I've been most fascinated with over the years, just for a variety of reasons.
So I want to get back to that in a moment, but before we get to there, your time at Edinburgh, tell us about that.
Yeah, so I had the privilege to study at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Most of you are familiar with that institution. It's got a long storied background, and the Div School there has a great history of famous and well-known scholars throughout the years. So it was a real honor to study there. I was able to study with Larry Hurtado. Some of you know Larry. He's known for really two things: his views of early Christology, and his book Lord Jesus Christ, his sort of biggest, most famous tome in his recent years. And then the other thing he's well known for is Christian origins, textual criticism to some extent, and even issues dealing with Jesus tradition and Jesus books. And Larry was great to study with. Larry's not an evangelical, and he's just recently passed away, most of you probably know. Larry was not an evangelical, but he was friendly to evangelicals, and he was a great mentor for me to allow, he would push and challenge me on things in a way that was appropriate for a professor to do, but not in a way that I felt like he was, out to get me. And what was great about it is he and I have stayed friends for many, many years, and I contributed to his Festschrift, and he's endorsed some of my books, and Larry and I wouldn't agree on everything, but that's actually the beauty of it, is a camaraderie and an intellectual respect there that I think is great. And there's other great scholars I got to study with there at the institution that I could go into. But it was a delightful time, and my oldest daughter, Emma, was born there in Scotland, in the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh, Scotland. If you ever want to know about British healthcare, come talk to me. I'll give you my story at least. And that was quite the experience. So
you've now been in the RTS system. roughly close to 20 years?
Yeah, coming up on 20 years. So I started at RTS Charlotte in 2001 and have been a New Testament professor there ever since and still am. And then eventually became academic dean and then, of course, now president, and became president of the campus about 7 years ago. And most of you probably know RTS is a very confusing institution in terms of the number of campuses. We have 8 campuses across the United States now, but really 3 bigger ones in Charlotte, Jackson, and Orlando, and then a handful of smaller ones in places like DC, Atlanta, New York, Houston, and Dallas.
Very good. So giving your time over the years to Christian origins, New Testament study, I'm curious which scholars have shaped you, both living and dead. I mean, is it the F.F. Bruce Metzger? I mean, who are the people that you really read behind and appreciated and have contributed to your formation?
Yeah, here's what's interesting is that one of the things I've wanted to do is take a lot of my theological influences and bleed them over into historical study. And this is one of the things I think has not been done. So for example, I'm very influenced by, no surprise, the Protestant reformers. Tomorrow in my lecture, actually, I'll talk about the view of the patristic fathers on how he identifies scriptural books, and I'll talk about a little bit about how that mirrored what the Protestant reformers did. But the way you think about scripture, the way you think about epistemology, the way you think about worldview is very much that I'm committed and influenced by the Protestant reformers. And truthfully, a lot of the Puritans very much influenced me in terms of my ministry and thinking and so on. And then I've tried to take that and apply it to the world of biblical studies. And so my book, Canon Revisited, was sort of looking at the world of canon through the lens of certain epistemological frameworks that you get from theology and how you think about that with canon. And so my influences have been theological influences that I've tried to bring over on the historical side. Now, on the historical side, my influences there have been not necessarily even Christian scholars, depending on the way you look at it. So if you're looking at textual criticism and so forth, certainly Metzger would be a player. But beyond that, I mean, Larry himself was an influence, and anybody who does work in sort of codicological work, paleography, apocryphal gospels, those sorts of things all had influences on me in various ways, but not theologically, obviously.
So as it relates to RTS Charlotte, tell us what you're most encouraged by what's taking place.
Yeah, so RTS Charlotte just celebrated a couple years ago its 25th anniversary in Charlotte. So right now we're in about the year 2728 in Charlotte, which is really encouraging to see how the Lord has grown our campus. We're now the 2nd largest campus in the RTS system, just slightly behind Orlando. We're the largest MDiv campus in the RTS system, which is very encouraging for us. You and I were talking, Jason, last night coming to dinner, that one of the things we've started recently in the Charlotte campus is a new program in biblical counseling. So we launched a new degree program about 4 years ago in biblical counseling that we've been very encouraged by, not just because it's cranking out good counselors, although it is doing that, but the benefit we did not anticipate as much as the way it blesses our MDiv students. Because our MDiv students need help in how to do counseling. And so a lot of our MDiv students are doing an emphasis in counseling. So it's an MDiv with a counseling emphasis. And so what you have is MDiv students and counseling students all in these same classes. And that's been really wonderful. I think both need each other. Counseling students need the MDiv students need the counseling students. And it's a wonderful harmony to see those two come together. So that's been a bright spot for us. We're really encouraged by.
So tell us as it relates to New Testament studies, what issues are on your mind these days? Not just the broader academy, but as it relates to the evangelical church.
Wow, lots of different things going on. Depends on what you mean by New Testament studies. Certainly one of the hot topics in recent years is hermeneutical issues in New Testament, trajectory hermeneutics in New Testament, which I think we all know deals with this sort of idea that, well, the Old and New Testament neither give you the answer fully. They just set you on a trajectory and you have to map it out going from there. So obviously, when you talk about gender issues or other types of issues in the Bible, well, the Bible doesn't give you these answers. It just sets you on a trajectory that goes on out. So those things are still out there that I think are concerning and certainly need a lot of attention. I still think historical critical issues are on the table that are always in play that our students need to be aware of, the latest that is going on in those categories. It's not so much new things, but just like we all know in our fields, it's the same issues that keep popping up again and again, and you just have to keep, it's like whack-a-mole at the thing, you just got to keep at it, keep hitting it, pops up here, pops it there, and so in the field of New Testament studies, there's still these critical issues that need attention, whether issues pertaining to books authorships or inerrancy questions, reliability questions. Those still need our attention as scholars and pastors. And so one of my lessons to the students is always, look in your churches for ways to address these issues appropriately. It's not that you want to do a 5-part sermon series on textual criticism or something like that. No one would come back probably. But you need to find some way to inoculate your congregations against these things. And you don't want the first person they hear these problems from to be Bart Ehrman. They need to say when they hear the problem, oh, I know about this problem. My pastor in a Sunday school class or something has told me about these problems, and I'm familiar at least broadly with the contours of this. And so that's always one of my exhortations to the students.
We were talking last night about your book that came out, I guess, in 2018.
Yes.
And
yes.
The topic of second century Christianity. What's the formal name of the book?
Christianity at the Crossroads was the main title, and the subtitle was How the Second Century Shaped the Future of the Church. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed that book. We talked about it last night. I guess my question for you and for the group is, why and how did that kind of become the forgotten century?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the book he's talking about was effectively a book on second century Christianity, and it actually was Larry Hurtado who called it the Cinderella century. And I thought that was interesting as a way to describe it. I think it's probably forgotten for a couple of reasons. One is, in the biblical study side of things, everyone wants to talk about the first century, because that's when the books are, for the most part, right? And so you're going to be a first century person if you're a biblical studies, in particular, New Testament guy. And then if you're a patristics guy, well, there's not a lot to talk about in the second century, right? The more interesting things start happening in the third and into the fourth. And now you start talking about sort of the major Nicene or Chalcedonian constructions, and you're starting to talk about these sorts of things. You have more data, you have more writings, and then the middle is that second century where things are foggy. And then I think there's probably a third reason is that Protestants probably don't get all they wish they had in the second century. And what I mean by that is, second century is a time where the church is still figuring out how to say things and articulate things and put things together. And so if you're a Protestant looking for evidence that the church says it a way that we know the Bible's teaching, you're not going to get as much precision in the second century. It's not so much the second century is against Protestantism. I don't think it is. It's just it's not as clear as it is in later centuries. So all those reasons, it's been forgotten, and I was excited to dive into it. I mean, one of the corollary things I really enjoyed about writing is I was surprised by what I found. Sometimes when you write a book, you know what you're going to get before you write it. And I knew that a little bit, but what I was surprised by was the relevance of the second century for the 21st century. And what I mean by that is that Christians in the second century were in an embattled cultural minority trying to keep their head above water. And I saw so many links to that situation in our modern day. And even though in America, of course, we still very much have a lot of influence, that's waning, as we all know. And it did strike me as there's a lot of comparisons there that were very, very fitting.
The productive scholar is the motivated scholar.
Mm-hmm.
You manage to be productive even while you're ministering at campus. What motivates you?
Wow, that's a great question. Part of the way I view scholarship is, and this sounds like a strange way to say it, I view it as a form of shepherding. I know that's a weird way to put it, but this is part of what motivates me, is it I envision the person in the pew who needs clarity, help, and truth taught to them, and I ask the question, what's the best way to make sure that person is cared for, shepherded towards clarity and truth in their life theologically? And the answer is either I can write a book they can read to bless them, or I can write a book that blesses their pastor that can bless them, or I can write a book that blesses the scholar that teaches the pastor that blesses them. But either way you look at it, that the end game is the person in the pew that I'm thinking about. And so, I know scholars operate with lots of different motivations, and I think there are multiple good motivations. For me, it's not that I think writing for the academy alone is bad. I think there's a place for that, and some scholars probably just write for their fellow scholars. But if I write for my fellow scholars, I actually still have a derivative reason for writing, which is I want to influence more scholars so they can teach more pastors, so they can teach more people in the pew.
It's all for the church.
It's for the church. Yeah, I gave you a motto right there. That's like they're going to think that was a setup question. It really wasn't. I do love y'all's motto. It's a great motto. I mean, I think every seminary on one level, I'm sure, shares it. Should share it.
Back to hermeneutics.
Yeah.
TIS, a common topic these days of conversation. Handicap it for us.
Just give me the acronym again.
Yeah, TIS, Theological Interpretation of Scripture.
Yes. Yeah, that's not really an area I've done as much in as I wish I could. I think there's probably some guys in this room that could probably speak to that more intelligently than me. But I mean, it kind of gets back a little bit to the hermeneutica issue I was bringing up a minute ago.
Yeah, so just zoom out a touch then, not just that, but more broadly, other issues in contemporary hermeneutics that you're seeing, you're thinking about, you're engaging.
Yeah, I think, there was the I don't know if blow up's the right word, but a number of years ago, there's still this question of how to view Christ in the Old Testament and the proper way to do it. And there was a debate about Christocentric versus Christotelic pictures of Christ in the Old Testament. And I still think that's an issue that needs attention, because there are certain ways that you can construe Christ in the Old Testament where the person says, yeah, the New Testament writers saw him there, but he wasn't really there. And I still think that is a breaking apart of the covenants and a breaking apart of the testaments that's a problem. Closely related to that hermeneutically is also a movement amidst in certain evangelical circles that finds the Old Testament to be largely irrelevant. That finds it not only to be irrelevant, honestly finds the Old Testament to be somewhat of a problem. And that if we can just kind of bypass it or leave it behind, that we're better off without it. I find that to be part of a hermeneutical problem, part of a theological problem that I think is really, really troubling. And certainly I'm sure those in this room would share that concern. And I think, there's always complications and always difficulties of mapping out how New Covenant, Old Covenant differ, and those conversations are important to have. But sort of severing the ties entirely, that's a move that would, I'm sure, concern most of us.
Sure. Current writing projects?
Yeah, so currently, I've just wrapped up my first lay-level book that I'm excited about. It is fitting for our conversation today with Bart Ehrman. Actually, it's a book I intended to write for my daughter Emma before she went to college, but it is basically, the book is titled Surviving Religion 101, and it's a guide to Christian college students how to survive life at a secular university. So, and that is with Crossway and should be out spring of 21. And I'm excited about that. It's my first foray into the lay level world, which is something my wife has been after me on for a while. And I finally listened. I should have listened a long time ago. So that's generally a statement for all husbands and the way they relate to their wives. Should have listened a long time ago. But I should have. But I'm thrilled about it, and I'm hopeful that it'll be helpful for college students.
So flesh that book out a little bit.
Yeah. So I have 15 chapters in the book, and I tackle 15 key questions that I anticipate my daughter Emma will face in college. And the book is actually constructed as letters to my daughter from her father about what she'll face in college. And so those 15 chapters deal with major worldview issues, intellectual issues, and so on.
Dating?
No, I don't. Although I might add a chapter 16 now. That's a good idea.
In my mind, that's like chapter 1 these days.
Yes. You know what the book isn't? There's a lot of these out there. There's a number of books out there that are sort of how-to manuals for college, like how to get along with your roommate, how to keep up with your grades. And those are important books too. That's just not this book. This book is narrowly on surviving intellectually. And so it's 15 chapters that deal with all kinds of critical worldview issues that I know she'll face. And I think framing it around letters to my daughter, obviously it's letters to her, but anybody can read them. That's the whole point of the book, obviously. That I think it'll soften the feel of it, so it won't just seem like hopefully an intellectual exercise, but it'll seem also father to daughter type scenario. And I deal with a lot of foundational questions. I deal with stuff you would anticipate, which is, does the Bible contradicts itself type questions? Those would be kind of low-hanging fruit. But I also deal with epistemological questions, such as, why is it that I should think that I'm right and all my professors are wrong? I mean, what statistical likelihood of that? That's a legitimate question, right? If I go off to secular school and I'm a Christian and most of my professors aren't, do I really think that almost all my professors are wrong and I'm right? I'm 19 and I'm right, but they're all wrong. What grounds do I have to think that? Those kinds of questions are going to haunt the average college student. They're going to think, don't they know more than me? So I deal with those kinds of questions too.
As a gospel minister, what most concerns you about the 21st century church?
There's so many different directions to go there.
Think American, domestic.
Oh yeah. part of the reason I wrote the book we just described is, this sounds a bit like a truism, but I wonder often how well we're passing down to the next generation what our core beliefs are. And part of the way I've seen this is, it used to be in years gone by that when seminary students would show up at your door, you could pretty much believe that they're there because they already agree with you on pretty much everything you're going to be teaching them in broad strokes. What we found is that's not true anymore. We have a lot of seminary, not a lot, we have some seminary students showing up at our door who want to be there and they want to go in the ministry, but they are quietly disagreeing with us on all kinds of key issues.
And what might those issues be?
Well, no surprise that one of the key categories is issues of sexuality. So, we're gonna hold the line on traditional biblical views on sexuality, and rather than openly object, they'll just quietly disagree. And it's not so much that it's secret; it's just that they're not with us when they come in, and they may not be with us when they leave. And they're just going to take that issue and they're going to cut it off and they're going to move it over here and going to say it just doesn't matter, or it's not important, or I don't want to talk about it, or I just simply disagree. And they'll try to retain Orthodox Christianity while holding out that area as an exception. And what's concerning for me about the future of the church is we've got to deal with that problem with the next incoming group, because all our students are coming out of universities. Some out of Christian schools where that problem isn't so keen, but they're coming out of universities. They've already been 4 years inculcated with that. And by the time they get to us, we have to undo all that's been done. We have to almost deprogram them. And that's concerning, because those are the future pastors and leaders. So we've got to find a way to make sure that we're dealing with that problem adequately.
So I asked you, as a gospel minister, what most concerns you about the 21st century church internally. Let me tweak the question a bit.
Sure.
As a gospel minister, what most concerns you for the 21st century church?
As in terms of things from the outside?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think someone asked me the other day who was from another country. I was sitting down with someone from Scotland the other day. This was actually just 2 days ago, and they were visiting. They're missionaries. They're from Scotland, and they were visiting the States. And they said, so don't you feel a lot more encouraged about the direction of the United States, given that you have at least a party in power that seems more sympathetic to evangelicals? And without getting into the current political issues, I said, no. I actually feel like whatever's happening there culturally is a finger in the dam, and it just is delaying the inevitable. I have little doubt that whatever happens politically in the next 2 years or 2 cycles, regardless who wins or who loses, that the momentum of our culture is very much going to make Christianity not only a minority voice, but maybe an illegal minority voice at some point, at least in many of the things we believe. And this takes me back to the 2nd century situation again, is that amazingly, Christians in the 2nd century prevailed having hardly any quantity of numbers, having any political influence, having any cultural influence, and really no clout in the culture at all.
Nothing but faithfulness.
Yeah, in 300 years, they had taken over the entire empire. And we need to learn that lesson again. I'm not saying, therefore, we're not concerned about the direction of our country. Of course we are. What I think, though, is that once that tidal wave hits, then we need to recapture again what it means to be faithful as a minority voice in our world. And if we don't have that, if we think the only way to survive is just to keep cultural power, we're going to be in a lot of trouble.
As a seminary president, what most challenges you operationally at RTS Charlotte?
Been very encouraged by where we're going at RTS Charlotte, and certainly, as I said, we've got a lot of good news. I think what concerns me is some of the cultural issues I just mentioned are leading to less people going into seminary, less people going into vocational ministry. Now, of course, on one level, that's concerning because how does seminary survive in the midst of lower numbers? But that's not really what I mean when I say it concerns me, although that's a problem. We want to train people going into ministry. So, my concern as a seminary president is I don't exist. We don't exist if God doesn't call people into ministry. And so my prayer for the church and my role is that, Lord, keep sending people into the harvest so that we can keep training them and that we can keep sending them out. And truthfully, I'm always amazed they show up. Every year we get a new class. I'm always like, I can't believe you guys came. And it's not that I'm trying to be a pessimist. It's just that I still marvel that people want to do this with their life. Right. I'm like, are you sure you want to be here? Have you thought this through? And chances are no, they haven't thought this through, but maybe that's good. Maybe it's good that they haven't thought it through so that they can still be there. But no, my concern as a president is I just want the Lord. I know the Lord will do this. He said he would, although not always in the same numbers, but keep sending people into the harvest. That's what we exist for. That's who we want to train.
So just a few minutes left. Let's play rapid fire.
Yes. Uh-oh. Last time someone did that, it didn't go well, but all right.
I did not say word. I did not say word.
Not one-word answers. Okay, no
yeah.
one-word answers.
Or two-word. Favorite book in the Bible?
Favorite book in the Bible, I'm probably going to say, this is very cliche, but I can't get away from it. Probably Romans. It's my desert island book. I'd take it and build my life on it.
In your opinion, the most underappreciated book in the Bible?
I think probably, that's an interesting, I don't know if I've been asked that question. I'd probably say the Catholic letters, if I could tweak the answer. I think the Catholic letters are the most unappreciated part of the Bible, at least in my corpus, or at least on the New Testament side. I think there's so much there. And truthfully, there's a lot in the Catholic letters that are fitting for our day because, as we all know, the Catholic letters have a lot to do with heresy and false teaching. And I think we need more of that instruction.
Meaning the same, but we prefer to refer to them as the universal letters.
What's that now?
I'm teasing you. Something about the word Catholic.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So,
yeah.
We prefer
Small
universal
C, in
letters.
case everyone wants to know.
Right, that's right.
General epistles, how's that? So.
Books you're currently reading?
Oh, wow. Well, on the non-theological side, I'm finishing up David McCullough's 1776, which is, of course, well-known in various ways. I try to keep up with different literature. Also on the non-Christian side, I just finished Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, which I've read long ago and I read again. I just try to keep up with different literature. On the Christian side, I'm working through Christobiography with Craig Keener now, which is a bit of genre question and Jesus tradition question. So,
who are your favorite preachers?
Oh, wow. What's funny is I don't really, there's many men I appreciate and respect, obviously, in the pulpit. I mean, in my world, in the PCA, certainly Tim Keller would be one I appreciate and respect. Certainly, there's many in the Baptist world, certainly appreciate and respect John Piper in the pulpit and many others. I think our own Chancellor, Ligon Duncan, is a fantastic preacher and one I always enjoy listening to. Part of my favorite preachers are historical. I like to read sermons as well. And I've got to say, historically, Lloyd Jones has always been one of my favorite preachers. And certainly, I have the whole stack of Spurgeon sermons on the shelf, which ought to make everybody here really happy, he's wonderful.
Favorite figures from church history?
In the early church, which I have a lot of figures there I work with, and you'll hear more from them tomorrow. One of my sort of ancient mentors is Irenaeus, who's a 2nd century heresy fighter, and is always someone who I look up to as a great picture of what it means to be a church father, so to speak. I'm very influenced by the Puritans. I try to read Richard Baxter's The Reformed Pastor about every 3 years, and every time I read it, I'm convinced I'm not a Christian after I finish reading the thing. If you haven't read that book, then you need to read it, and then you'll know what I'm talking about when you finish reading it. And so I lean heavily on Puritan writers and very much appreciate a lot of those. And John Bunyan's work, again, would make this crew happy, is very influential as well.
Biblical character you most identify with?
Man, I love these questions, Jason. I've never heard some of these before, at least as autobiographically.
I'm saving my best for last.
Yes. Probably, identify with in certain ways. And I would say I feel like I identify with Peter in the sense that I feel like you rush headlong into things and think, man, what was I thinking? And Peter can kind of jump ahead of the gun, and you feel like he's always more energy than sense sometimes. And so I feel like I can identify with that feeling occasionally. What
do we have to do to make you become a Credo Baptist?
Yes, you did save the best for last. Well, I will say this.
You have to return to your roots, Mike.
Yes. Move back to Kansas City, become a Baptist again, who knows? Yes, one of the things we were talking about at the table is, RTS has a unique situation because even though we're a Westminster Confession school, we actually have Reformed Baptists on our faculty as actual voting residential faculty members. You may not know that. So my question back to you, Jason, is when are you going to hire a Presbyterian professor as one of your faculty to keep the camaraderie going.
We don't put asterisks by our
Yeah, exactly. There you go.
Seriously, the final question, which is the more serious one, a word of encouragement for PhD students and aspiring PhD students in the room.
Yes, if you're a PhD student, several things that I want to encourage you with. A, you're not wasting your life. In case you wondered that, you're not wasting your time. Yes, you feel like you're learning all this minutia that no one cares about, and you're right, no one does care about it, but it doesn't mean you're wasting your life because you're laying an important foundation to train future ministers of the word. The other thing I'll say to your PhD students is being a successful PhD student is actually got a lot less to do with intelligence than you think. Now, that may sound like a backdoor insult, and it really isn't meant to be. It's meant to be that I know a lot of very smart people that can never get a PhD because PhD is more about endurance and about perseverance than it is about sheer intelligence. I know that everybody has at least a base level of intelligence to do the PhD work they're doing, but endurance is the key. So just one foot in front of the other, keep running. Doesn't have to be fast, just keep running.
This has been great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.